I've spent half my life in the woods, and still, after all these years, I can't tell where the real forest ends and where something else begins. The line between nature and nightmare, it blurs so easily out here. You think you know what's watching you. You think it's just an animal. But the woods have a way of listening first. Then they answer. I was 24 when I first put on the uniform. It felt like a promise. A patch of green and gold stitched onto my shoulder that told me I was part of something bigger. Protector, caretaker, witness. I worked out of a small ranger station in northern Washington, the kind that creaks when you open the door and smells faintly of pine resin and old coffee grounds. My post covered several hundred square miles of terrain. Deep timber, basalt cliffs, and lakes so clear you could see the bones of fallen trees resting on the bottom. The old-timers used to say this forest was ancient in a way that didn't care about people. Some of them called it the breath because fog never really left the valleys. It just waited, pulsing and shifting, inhaling the light. I didn't believe in superstition back then, not really. I came from a family that believed in doing, not fearing. My father was a firefighter. My mother worked dispatch. Fear was something you acknowledged, not something that ruled you. But that confidence, God, that confidence can make you blind. The first time I felt something I couldn't explain was late autumn of my first year. The wind had been still for days, the kind of quiet that makes the air thick, like the whole forest is holding its breath. I was called out to check a reported campfire near the ridgeline. No permit, no signal, just a thin column of smoke. I hiked out near dusk, the sun melting into the fog. When I reached the clearing, the smoke was gone, the ashes still warm. No tent, no footprints, not even tire marks. Just 3 stones arranged in a triangle around the fire pit, and on each, what looked like a handprint, not burned, not painted, imprinted. I touched one. The stone felt soft beneath my glove, like skin that shouldn't have been that warm in the cold. I jerked my hand back and noticed my radio crackle on its own. A faint voice, like static, whispered something short. I couldn't make out the words, but it sounded like my own name. I told myself it was interference. A ranger up north, maybe, bouncing through the trees. But when I hiked back, the forest seemed to lean closer, the fog pooling thicker behind me, as if something were moving just out of view. That night, I didn't sleep much. Every time I closed my eyes, I kept thinking of that triangle of stones, glowing faintly in the dark, like coals that refused to die. A week later, I found the first disappearance. A hunter, 52, experienced, local. He'd checked in with dispatch, given his coordinates, and never returned. We organized a search party. I led the southern line, working up the riverbank where the moss grew in thick curtains from the trees. It was quiet except for the sound of water gnawing at stone. Around noon, I spotted something hanging from a branch ahead. Cloth. A piece of the hunter's flannel, snagged on a low limb. The ground beneath it was disturbed, soft with mud. I crouched down thinking I'd find boot prints, but there weren't any. Just one deep impression, like something heavy had knelt there, and scattered around it, claw marks. 5 of them, each wider than my palm. We never found the man. The official report said presumed loss to exposure. I signed it myself, but I couldn't shake the smell that lingered in that clearing, a sour, musky odor, like wet fur and iron. From then on, I noticed things, small at first. A tree I'd sworn wasn't there the day before. Deep, rhythmic knocks echoing through the valley at night, like a heartbeat rolling through the hills. Sometimes I'd hear it while out on patrol, and when I'd radio in, one night, late winter, I was alone in the tower. It's perched about 40 feet above the ridge, built in the 1940s, a skeleton of steel and glass. You can see the whole valley from there, when the fog doesn't swallow it. Around midnight, I heard tapping on the glass. Slow, deliberate. I thought it was wind-blown branches, but when I turned off the lamp, I saw it. A silhouette on the outer deck, huge, broader than a man, shoulders hunched. The moon caught its outline, hair, maybe, or matted fur, and 2 eyes that reflected white, not red. For a second, we both froze. Then it turned away, moving with impossible grace, and vanished into the trees. The tapping stopped, but something remained, a faint smell drifting in through the cracked window, that same metallic musk. I climbed down at dawn and found footprints in the frost. Long, flat, and human-like, but wider. Too wide. They trailed off into the woods where the snow thinned into mud. That was the night my logic started to fracture. I reported what I saw. They told me I'd been overworked. That isolation can distort perception, especially in winter. They offered time off. I refused. Because the forest doesn't stop needing you just because you're afraid. Still, I started carrying a recorder. Not for proof, but for sanity. I wanted to hear the difference between what was real and what wasn't. For weeks, it was silent. Just the wind, the chatter of birds, the groan of wood under weight. Until one morning while reviewing the tape, I heard a faint whisper beneath it all. 3 words, over and over. Don't look back. At first, I thought it was my own voice layered over from some accidental recording. But the cadence was wrong. It dragged at the edges, almost as if something were trying to learn how to speak. That same day, a hiker came into the station. Young woman, trembling, mud caked up to her knees. She'd been camping near the caves south of the ridge, said she heard voices in the night. Not human, deep, guttural, like laughter caught in a hollow throat. She'd run until dawn, her tent still pitched, backpack still zipped. When she described where she'd camped, my stomach turned. It was near the same valley where the hand-marked stones had been. I went back there the next afternoon. The triangle of stones was gone. In its place was a shallow depression in the earth, filled with water, and floating in it, small branches arranged in the same pattern, a reflection of something trying to rebuild itself. The air felt heavy, thick enough to chew. I remember my breath frosting in front of me, though the temperature wasn't that low. I knelt to take a sample, and that's when I heard it, knocking. 3 sharp knocks from deep inside the tree line. Then silence. Then 3 more, farther away. I turned, flashlight cutting through the fog, and for a second I saw movement, a shadow darting between trees too fast for its size. The rhythm of the knocks grew erratic, closer, until it sounded like it was circling me. I ran. I don't remember the trail, only the weight of the forest closing in, the sound of my boots slapping the mud, the mist burning my lungs. When I reached the truck, my hands were shaking so bad I couldn't get the key into the ignition. I slammed the door, locked it, and waited. Minutes passed before the fog began to clear. Through the windshield, I saw handprints forming on the glass, large, wet, smeared downward like someone dragging their fingers. Then they faded, one by one, leaving only the condensation. I didn't report that one. Some things you keep to yourself because saying them out loud makes them real. After that, I noticed I wasn't the only one changing. The forest itself seemed to breathe differently. Birds stopped singing near dusk, the air lost its usual hum of insects, and the trees started to lean. Just slightly, but always toward the station, as if listening. Then came the spring incident. A volunteer went missing near the cave system at the base of Mount Delarue. When we found his radio, it was still transmitting a faint signal, static mixed with what sounded like movement. Wet footsteps, shallow breathing, and once a voice saying, "Stay down there." We recovered his pack the next day. Inside was his journal. The last entry was dated 2 nights before. I saw it again, standing at the mouth of the cave. It looked like me. That's when I started to dream about the cave. Every night I'd wake up to the sound of water dripping, echoing endlessly, a pulse in the dark guiding me deeper. And just before waking, I'd see shapes, tall, angular silhouettes pressed against stone, their faces hidden in shadow. By early summer, I couldn't tell the difference between waking and dreaming anymore. I'd find myself standing outside the tower, flashlight off, listening to something move just beyond reach. Once, I caught my reflection in the window, and for a second, just a fraction of a breath, it wasn't me staring back. The first time I realized the forest had learned my rhythm was on a routine patrol, mid-July. Sunlight was bright, the kind that filters through branches in fractured patterns, turning the ground into broken mirrors. I remember thinking, maybe the worst is behind me. Maybe winter had warped my mind. But halfway down the trail, I heard footsteps behind me. Light at first, almost playful. I stopped. Silence. I took a few more steps. There it was again, matching me exactly. Not echoing, not delayed. Mirroring. I spun around fast, hand on my sidearm. Nothing. Just trees swaying gently, their shadows long across the dirt. I stood there, heart pounding, until I noticed something wrong. The shadows. They weren't swaying in time with the wind. They bent slower, deliberate like bodies leaning closer. I left that trail without finishing the patrol. When I got back to the station, I locked the door and didn't leave until morning. The next day, I found claw marks on the back steps, fresh, cutting deep into the wood. I pressed my hand against them, and the grooves were longer than my fingers by a good inch. I tried to convince myself it was a bear, a mountain lion, anything with a name. But I knew better. I'd seen those impressions before, back when the hunter disappeared. The rangers I worked with started to notice changes in me. I'd jump at small sounds, stay quiet during briefings. One of them, Pete, older guy, 30 years in service, pulled me aside. He said, "Don't feed it." I asked him what he meant. He just shook his head, eyes fixed on the tree line. "You'll know if you already do." Then he walked away, never explaining. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about his words. Don't feed it. Was fear a kind of offering? Was every step I took in dread another piece of myself given away? The dreams grew worse. Always the cave. Always that slow dripping sound echoing through stone. But now, there was something else. A smell. Damp, metallic, sharp as rusted nails. And hands, too many hands, reaching from the dark, brushing against my skin as if guiding me forward. One night, I woke up to that smell in my cabin. Not in a dream, real, thick in the air. I sat up, and there at the edge of my bed was a wet handprint smeared across the wooden floorboards. I barely remember grabbing my flashlight, stumbling out the door. The night was so silent, it pressed against my ears. No crickets, no owls, nothing. Just my breath and the faint sound of water dripping somewhere it shouldn't have been. I followed it. God help me, I followed it down the trail, into the fog, until I reached the mouth of the cave. It gaped open, blacker than the forest, swallowing my beam of light. The dripping grew louder. Each drop echoed like a clock ticking, pulling me inside. I stood there for a long time, staring into that dark, and in it, I saw myself. Not my reflection, but another me, standing just beyond the threshold, face obscured in shadow, motionless, waiting. I couldn't move. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my body leaned forward as if I belonged there, as if I'd been walking toward that moment my whole life. And then, knock. 3 sharp knocks from deep within the cave. The sound of wood on stone, carried out like a signal. My double's head tilted, slow, unnatural, and the dripping stopped. Silence swallowed everything. That broke me free. I stumbled back, tripping over roots, running blind until the night air changed. When I looked back, the cave was gone. Just forest, thick and unbroken. I didn't sleep for 3 days after that. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure, felt that pull. The worst part wasn't fear. It was recognition. A sick part of me knew. Whatever lived in those shadows, it knew me too. By late summer, the disappearances grew harder to ignore. 2 hikers, then a backpacker, then a family of 3. Official cause always chalked up to accidents, exposure, getting lost. But I'd been to those sites. I'd seen the signs. The same wide impressions in the mud, the same claw marks gouged into bark, sometimes even the same strange triangle pattern rebuilt from sticks or stones. I started keeping maps with red circles connecting them like a web. They all pointed back toward the caves. I couldn't stay away anymore. Curiosity is its own kind of hunger, and mine was gnawing me alive, so I went back, this time in daylight. The cave was there. Mouth yawning open, colder than the air around it. I stepped inside. The first thing I noticed was the silence. No dripping, no breeze, just the sound of my own heartbeat. The walls were slick, damp beneath my fingers, narrowing as I moved deeper. I don't know how far I went before I heard it. A voice. Not echoing, not distorted, clear. My own voice calling my name. I froze. The flashlight flickered, And in that stuttering glow, I saw shapes pressed against the stone. Not carved, not painted, embedded. Faces. Dozens of them, mouths open in silent screams, eyes wide but hollow. The voice came again, closer, my own tone but wrong, stretched too thin. Come deeper. I stumbled back, dropping the light. Darkness swallowed me whole, and in that pitch black something moved past me, brushing my arm, cold and wet. I don't remember how I got out. My memory skips like a scratched record. One moment, I was inside, drowning in shadows. The next, I was outside, kneeling in the dirt, coughing like I'd been underwater too long. When I looked at my arm, there was a handprint pressed into my sleeve. Too large to be mine, too wet to be real. After that, the forest was never the same. The trees whispered at night. The fog carried shapes that lingered too long. And every time I passed by still water, I saw not my reflection, but that other me standing just a step behind. I started to wonder if maybe I'd never left the cave at all. The more I tried to reason it out, the more the forest seemed to tilt around me. Small things at first, the sound of my own voice delayed by a heartbeat when I called out to other rangers on the radio, the smell of wet stone where there shouldn't have been any. Then bigger things. Once on patrol, I found a campsite I didn't remember approving. It was perfect, too perfect. The tent was clean, the fire pit fresh, the footprints arranged in a neat circle like someone had staged them. I was about to radio it in when I saw my name carved into the picnic table. Not painted, carved. My full name in my own handwriting. I stood there staring at it, the letters so clean it was like they'd been cut yesterday. But I hadn't been there before. I would have remembered. I called it in, told dispatch I'd found a possible vandalized site. When I went back later with another ranger, the carving was gone. Just smooth, untouched wood as if it had never existed. I started to feel watched in ways that logic couldn't excuse. The animals stopped coming near my cabin. Even the birds avoided the feeders. One morning, I found my boots outside, neatly lined up, pointing toward the woods. I hadn't put them there. The smell hit next, earth and iron and something faintly sweet like decay masked by rain. I followed it to the back of the property where the creek cut through the trees. There, in the mud, were dozens of tracks, big ones, heavy. But here's what chilled me. Every single one faced toward my cabin, like something had come to visit and left without turning around. By then, I'd stopped sleeping properly. The nights were long stretches of half-dreaming where I could feel the forest breathing against the walls. Sometimes I'd wake to faint sounds under the floorboards. Scratching, then knocking, always 3 times. I thought about quitting, turning in my badge, leaving the station behind. But where would I go? You don't just walk away from the woods, they stay inside you. Besides, fear had become my routine. It was familiar. In a strange way, it felt like the forest wanted me to understand it, to see something no one else would. So I began documenting everything. I filled notebooks, sketches of tracks, maps of sounds, descriptions of smells, even the patterns of silence. The more I wrote, the more connected it all seemed. Like the forest wasn't just alive, it was communicating. One night, just before the first frost, I was writing by lantern light when the radio hissed. At first, just static. Then, faintly, a voice. Mine. It said, "Don't let them leave." I froze. The words came again, softer, slower, like someone speaking through water. I turned off the radio and sat in silence, the lantern flickering. Outside, the fog was pressing against the windows. I went to the door, half expecting to see nothing, like half dreading I'd see something. And I did. Shapes in the mist. Not people, too tall, too thin. They stood just at the tree line, unmoving. I blinked, and they were gone. The fog drifted in, curling around my legs like smoke. That night, the forest made a sound I'd never heard before. Not wind, not thunder. It was deep, resonant, a groaning like the earth itself shifting in its sleep. It shook the windows, rattled the dishes, and then stopped as abruptly as it began. The next morning, the ground behind the cabin had split open. A narrow fissure, deep enough that my flashlight beam disappeared before touching bottom. I should have reported it. I didn't. I couldn't. Because when I leaned over the edge, I heard something breathing from below. Slow. Wet. alive. I backed away and spent the rest of the day sitting on the porch, staring into the trees, wondering how far reason could stretch before it snapped. The rangers from the South Station came up a week later after losing contact with one of their own. The man had been patrolling near the same ridge where my first disappearance had happened years before. When they found his radio, it was still on. I listened to the playback. There was heavy breathing, a thud, then silence. After about 20 seconds, a voice said, "He's one of us now." I can't explain why, but hearing it made me feel like something inside me had finally cracked. Because deep down, I knew that voice too. It was mine. After that, I stopped trying to explain. The mind wants patterns, and sometimes the forest gives them, just not the kind we understand. I started to feel that everything out here was part of one long memory being replayed, a ritual older than language. Autumn came early that year. The trees turned fast, the air colder, and every sunset felt like it lasted too long. The shadows stretched impossibly far across the ground. One evening, while closing down the tower, I caught sight of movement across the valley, a figure walking along the ridge. At first, I thought it was another ranger, but when I raised my binoculars, I saw its face. It was me. Same uniform, same gait, same everything. He stopped and looked straight toward the tower. Then he lifted his hand and pointed at the trees behind me. I turned. There was nothing. When I looked back through the binoculars, the figure was gone. That was the moment I knew I'd reached the end of something. My service, my sanity, maybe both. I started hearing whispers during the day now, my own name carried on the wind, the forest speaking in repetition. At night, the dreams changed. No more caves. Now it was the tower. I'd wake to see the glass shaking, the door pounding from outside. In one dream, I opened it, and every tree around me had a face, not carved, grown, and all of them were mine. I thought about burning it all down, ending it before it spread, before whatever had crawled out of the earth decided it needed more. But fire feels small when the darkness is that big. So instead, I stayed, because that's what rangers do. We stay. We watch. We keep others safe, even when we can't save ourselves. The last entry I wrote in my logbook was simple. The forest wants to remember. It just needs someone to help it. That night, I took the lantern and walked toward the fissure behind the cabin. The fog was low, glowing faintly under the moonlight. I remember the sound of my boots sinking into the mud, the chill biting through my clothes, the silence thick as breath held too long. As I reached the edge, I heard the knocks again. 3, then 3 more, each louder than the last, echoing up from the earth like a heartbeat. And then I understood. It wasn't trying to scare me, it was calling me back. I dropped the lantern in. The flame spun as it fell, illuminating slick, black walls that pulsed like muscle. The air rose up warm and damp, smelling of soil and something ancient. I leaned forward, and for a brief second, I saw faces moving below, hundreds, maybe thousands, watching, whispering, shifting like waves. One of them looked just like me. Then the ground trembled, the fog thickened, and I felt the pull again. The same one I'd felt that night at the cave. This time, I didn't run. The earth swallowed the light, the knocks stopped, and everything went quiet. When the other rangers came weeks later, they said they found my cabin empty. Coffee still warm on the stove, my notebook open on the desk. They searched for days, but there was no sign of me, just a triangle of stones near the creek and a faint smell of wet fur and iron. Some say I got lost, others think I left, but I'm still here. In the wind that hums through the trees, in the knock that echoes through the valleys when the fog rolls in the breath between night and dawn. The forest remembers me now, and sometimes when the light hits just right, you can still see me standing at the ridge, watching, waiting, guarding the line between reason and what waits beyond it, because something always watches back. And in the stillness, when you think you're alone out there, listen closely. You might hear it too. 3 knocks, the forest breathing, and a whisper, soft, almost human. Don't look back. I've spent most of my adult life in the woods. People who meet me often say they envy my job. How peaceful it must be, they think, to live among trees, to breathe fresh air, to wake up with the sunrise filtering through pine branches. But peace isn't the same as silence, and silence isn't the same as safety. Out here, the woods have their own language. Sometimes they whisper, sometimes they warn, and sometimes, if you're unlucky enough to listen closely, they speak back. My name's not important. What matters is that I've been a forest ranger for 17 years, stationed in the northern reaches of Montana's backcountry, where the mountains lean into the clouds and the forests swallow the light by afternoon. My post covers roughly 120,000 acres of national forest. Most of it's forgotten by hikers and campers. But there are old trails out here, abandoned campsites from before the area was officially mapped. Those are the places that still breathe with something I can't quite explain. Places that remember. When I first started, I used to laugh at the older rangers and their superstitions. They'd tell me about lights moving between the trees, about hearing a name whispered when no one else was around, about the way the forest goes wrong before a storm. I thought it was folklore, maybe exhaustion, but I learned the truth the hard way. One night in late October, when the temperature dropped 20 degrees in an hour, and I found myself hiking toward an old unlisted campsite near Lark Hollow. The call had come in around 7:40 p.m., a faint distress signal picked up by a hiker's radio. The coordinates placed it somewhere near an old fire road that hadn't been used in decades. I packed light, flashlight, flare gun, radio, and my field knife. I told dispatch I'd check it out before the snow hit. I remember how calm the forest seemed when I set out, windless, almost too still. My boots sank softly into the damp earth, and every sound, the crunch of a twig, the distant drip of water, felt amplified. By the time I reached the clearing, it was nearly dark. The campsite was small, just 2 half-collapsed tents, their nylon walls brittle with age. A rusted lantern hung from a branch, swaying even though there was no wind. I called out, half expecting an echo. Nothing. I swept my flashlight across the ground and saw boot prints, old ones barely visible in the mud. But what caught my eye was the pattern. The steps led into the clearing and never led out. I radioed dispatch again. No response. Static. I turned the volume up and caught a burst of distortion. Then, faintly, my own voice repeating, "I'll check it out before the snow hits." I froze. It wasn't playback. It was live. The same tone, the same words said back to me through my own channel. I remember backing away slowly, thinking the signal had looped through interference. But then something rustled behind one of the tents, a soft, dragging noise like fabric pulled across bark. I swung the flashlight toward it, heart hammering. Nothing moved, but I could smell it, a heavy iron scent like wet metal. That smell followed me all the way back to my truck. I didn't sleep that night. And though I didn't tell anyone, I drove back to the site at dawn. The tents were gone. Even the footprints had faded under a thin layer of frost. But right where they had been, carved into a fallen log, was a single word: listen. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe vandals, maybe pranksters. But it stuck with me. The woods had told me to listen, and over the next few months, I did. There's a rhythm to the forest, a pulse beneath its stillness. You can feel it if you spend enough time alone. The shift in tone before a storm, the way the ravens go quiet before dusk, the sudden smell of soil turning cold. Every detail matters, because sometimes when something unnatural happens, it doesn't announce itself. It mimics what's normal until you realize too late that it's not. The second time it happened, it wasn't me who noticed first. It was my partner then, Rachel. She was younger, sharp, the kind of ranger who saw things others missed. We were assigned to patrol an area near Beartooth Ridge, where an old campground had been found vandalized, fires built in strange circles, animal bones arranged in stacks. Locals said teenagers were using it for parties, but Rachel said it didn't look like kids. The bones were clean, sun-bleached, and the arrangement too deliberate. We set up trail cams, thinking we'd catch whoever was responsible. That night, we camped a few hundred yards away. Around midnight, I woke to what I thought was Rachel whispering outside my tent. but when I stepped out, she was still asleep in hers. The whispering continued, soft like a voice pressed against a wall. My flashlight beam cut through the trees, and that's when I saw them. Handprints. Dozens of them. Pressed into the trunks high up like someone or something had climbed and gripped the bark from above. Each print was wide, too wide to be human. When we reviewed the footage the next morning, most of it was static. But at 3:12 a.m., one camera caught movement. A shadow, large, humanoid, passing between trees. The shape was hunched, its arms too long. It paused, then turned toward the camera. The frame glitched, and it was gone. The only thing that remained was sound, low, guttural breathing, like something just inches from the microphone. We submitted the report. The footage disappeared before the week ended. The official explanation, corrupted data. Rachel requested reassignment after that. I didn't blame her. The older rangers told me stories after that, half warnings, half confessions. One talked about a watcher in the pines, something that moved without sound, that followed lost hikers until they stopped moving. Another said some of the old campsites were built over burial grounds, miners, trappers, or even older. But my favorite came from an old man named Harris. He'd worked the forest before me and claimed that every few decades the mountain called someone back. The woods remember faces, he told me once, tapping the ash from his cigarette, and if you listen too long, they remember your voice too. I laughed back then. I don't anymore. Last winter, I was reassigned to check on a stretch of trail near Granite Basin. Snow had buried most of the markers, and the cabins up there hadn't been used in years. I brought a snowmobile and a thermal blanket, planning to camp overnight. Around 5 p.m., I found an old ranger post half collapsed under snow. The logbook inside was still intact, its pages brittle but readable. The last entry was from 1993. It simply said, "Tracks at the perimeter again, not human." I spent that night inside the post by the stove. The wind howled like a living thing, pushing against the boards, slipping through the cracks. I heard it again then, the same dragging sound I'd heard years ago near Lark Hollow. Only this time it circled the cabin. I held my breath, turned off the lamp, and listened. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. Then, 3 knocks. Slow, deliberate. When I finally worked up the courage to look, there were no prints in the snow. But there was that smell again. Iron, wet, heavy. I left before dawn. You learn to live with fear out here, to file it away in the same place as loneliness and cold. But some things don't stay buried. They resurface when the wind shifts or when the forest goes too quiet. They return when you close your eyes and hear your own heartbeat echo back. And sometimes you realize it's not echoing at all. 2 months passed before I heard it again, the knocking. This time it came while I was back at the ranger station, a squat wooden building that creaked like it had lungs of its own. It was well past midnight, and I'd been cataloging maintenance reports, half listening to the static hum of the shortwave radio. There were only 2 of us on duty, me and a new guy named Porter. Fresh out of school, eager, unscarred. The knock came from the back door. 3 times. Even. It wasn't the sound of wood contracting or wind rattling a frame. It was intentional. I froze mid-sentence and looked toward the hallway. Porter was in the radio room, and when the knock came again, he shouted, "You expecting someone?" I shook my head, grabbed the flashlight, and walked to the door. I could see my breath, even inside. The air had gone cold too quickly for the heater to fail. When I opened the door, nothing was there. But the snow just beyond the porch looked disturbed, like something had been pacing, stopping, pacing again. I stepped out, scanning the dark. My flashlight beam trembled against the trees. For a moment, I thought I saw movement, something tall stepping behind a pine. Then the radio inside crackled violently, followed by Porter's voice shouting, "What the hell is that sound?" I ran back in. The speakers were alive with noise, something between a growl and static, looping over itself, rising and falling like breathing. I leaned close, and underneath the distortion, I heard something else. Listen, it was barely audible, but it was there. My chest went tight. The same word, the same voice I'd heard years ago. I shut off the radio. The sound didn't stop. It was coming from the walls. We left the building that night, spent the next few hours sitting in the truck until sunrise. The sound faded with the light. By morning, it was like nothing had happened. But from then on, Porter wouldn't stay in the station alone, and neither would I. Over the years, I've tried to reason through these things, to file them under logic, as any ranger should. Maybe sound distortion, temperature shifts, the tricks of an old structure. Maybe. But reason feels thinner out here. It doesn't stand up to the silence the forest holds. Because every time I think I've explained it away, something else happens, something that cracks the shell I build around myself, like the time I found the lost tent. That was last spring up near Elk Pass. It was early morning, frost still clinging to the edges of the grass when I spotted it, a green dome tent just off the trail. It looked new, almost too new. The fabric was clean, the zippers intact. I called out, announced myself. No reply. I unzipped the entrance halfway and peered in. The sleeping bag was laid out, still zipped as if someone had just stepped out to stretch. But inside the tent, the ground was dry, untouched. No footprints, no sign of anyone. I stepped back, circled the area. The odd thing was there were no tracks leading to it. The tent sat in the middle of an undisturbed patch of grass. It shouldn't have been there. I reported it to dispatch, gave coordinates, told them I'd wait for backup. Then I sat down nearby and listened. The forest was dead quiet. Too quiet. The birds had stopped. No wind, no rustle, just the faint hum of my own breath in the air. After a while, I caught the smell again. Iron. The same one. And then a new sound, a slow, wet dragging coming from just behind the tree line. I stood up, called out again. The sound stopped. The woods swallowed it whole. I took one step toward the trees, and that's when I heard it, a voice, soft, close whispering from inside the tent behind me. It said, "Don't leave." When I turned around, the tent had collapsed. I didn't unzip it again. I just backed away, grabbed my pack, and hiked straight to the ridge. When the others arrived 2 hours later, the tent was gone. Not a shred of it remained. You start to feel watched after things like that. Stop trusting your eyes, your memory. You double-check locks, radios, tracks, even your own voice. And that's when the real danger starts, when fear becomes part of your routine. A few weeks after the tent incident, I began having dreams. Always the same one. I'm standing in the forest at night, holding my flashlight, and I hear the knocking again. Only this time it's coming from beneath me, from inside the earth. I kneel, press my ear to the ground, and hear a voice whispering, "You remember." I always wake up sweating, heart pounding, every time. But one night, I didn't wake up alone. I keep a small cabin near the edge of the reserve, a place for solitude when I'm off duty. I woke to the sound of footsteps circling it, slow, dragging, methodical. My first thought was a bear, maybe elk. But then I heard something brush against the wall, like a hand sliding along the wood. I grabbed my light, stepped to the window, and I saw them. Prints in the snow, leading from the tree line to the cabin. Each one sunk deep, as if whatever made them weighed far more than it should. But there was only one of prints, and they stopped right at my door. No return path, just ended there. The next morning, they were gone. I don't tell these stories for sympathy. I tell them because the woods don't care what you believe. They're older than your fear, older than your logic. The forest has its own rules, its own truths. You can follow protocol, track patterns, analyze data, but none of that matters when something ancient decides to notice you. And it does notice. Sometimes at night, I swear I still hear the knocks. I try to ignore them. I focus on the crackle of the stove, the whistle of wind through the chimney. But it's hard to forget what Harris once told me. If you listen long enough, they listen back. I used to think the forest was my home. Now I think it's something else entirely, something alive, vast, patient. Maybe it's been waiting all along for someone to stay long enough, to learn its language. Maybe that someone was me. The breaking point came in late August, during one of those sweltering weeks when the forest feels like it's holding its breath. Everything was too still, too quiet, like the heat had smothered even the insects. I was assigned to survey an old network of trails west of the range, territory that had been closed to the public for years due to rock slides. There were rumors of squatters out there, maybe hunters camping illegally. Dispatch wanted eyes on it before the fall season began. The path was barely visible, swallowed by overgrowth. Halfway through the climb, I came across something unexpected, a wooden sign nailed to a dying tree. It was blank, weathered to the point where even the grain looked erased. The nails were new, though, fresh, shiny. That small detail stuck with me. Someone had been there recently. The trail narrowed into a ravine, then opened into a clearing that wasn't on any of our maps. The grass was flattened in wide arcs, as if something heavy had moved through, not walked, rolled or dragged. I followed the pattern until it stopped near the mouth of a cave carved into the rock wall. I knew the area well enough to be sure that cave wasn't supposed to be there. I radioed dispatch, gave coordinates, said I'd take a quick look before sunset. Static answered. I adjusted the antenna, tried again. Nothing. Then, through the interference, I heard a faint hum, steady, rhythmic, like breathing through a tunnel. It was coming from the cave. Everything in me said turn back. Every instinct, every protocol. But curiosity has always been stronger than caution in my line of work. I clipped a headlamp on, stepped inside. The air changed instantly. Cold, heavy, thick with moisture. The light barely cut through the dark. The cave walls were smooth, unnaturally so, as if worn down by hands rather than time. A few yards in, the tunnel split. To the left, a narrow path winding downward. To the right, the sound, the humming grew stronger. I turned right. The tunnel widened into a chamber, and that's where I saw it, an old campsite, or what was left of one. A rotted sleeping bag, a crushed lantern, a thermos half buried in dust. The ground was littered with bones. Animal, mostly, though a few didn't look quite right. Too long, too thin. And then I saw something scrawled across the cave wall in black soot. Listen. That word again. Always that word. The humming stopped. For a few seconds I stood there in silence, headlamp flickering. Then I heard movement. Soft, deliberate, echoing from somewhere deeper in the cave. Footsteps, slow and uneven. I called out, "Hello, park ranger. Anyone in there?" My voice bounced back to me, warped, delayed, as though something else repeated it a second later. Then the smell hit me. Iron. Thick and close. I started backing away, light shaking, my breath turning shallow. The footsteps grew faster. Not running, just longer strides. Confident, predatory. I could see nothing ahead of me, only the tunnel mouth faintly illuminated behind. Then, just as I turned, something brushed my shoulder. I didn't see it. I didn't need to. The cold that shot through me wasn't physical, it was knowing. The kind of knowing that lives beneath instinct, deeper than fear. That something had been waiting there, not for hours, not for days, but for me. I ran. The light caught the cave wall once more as I stumbled toward the entrance, and in that split second, I saw the handprints. Not carved, pressed. Dozens of them lining the stone, each one too large, too wide, too high to belong to any man. By the time I burst into daylight, the forest had changed. The air was motionless, the world washed in an unnatural stillness. My radio came alive again, hissing with white noise, and then a voice, my voice, came through it. "Don't leave." I smashed the radio on the rocks and didn't look back. When I returned to base, I filed a report. Omitted the details, of course. Said the trail was clear, cave unstable, unfit for exploration. But that night, when I checked the regional archives, I found something that made my stomach turn. The coordinates matched an area once known as Camp Morrow, a logging settlement abandoned in 1926 after a series of disappearances. The final entry in their foreman's journal mentioned strange music from under the ground. After that, nothing. No retrievals. No survivors. I closed the file and sat in silence for a long time, listening to the faint creaks of the station. Every sound felt deliberate. Every shadow seemed too aware. And for the first time, I wondered if this forest didn't just contain these mysteries, but fed on them. The thought settled in me like frost. I couldn't shake it. Over the following weeks, I began noticing patterns, Reports of strange noises, odd smells, missing wildlife, all centered near that same stretch of mountain. I should have left it alone, but something kept pulling me back, the way gravity pulls water downhill. One evening I returned, against orders, against reason. I brought only my flashlight, my camera, and a recorder. I wanted proof. Maybe part of me still believed that if I captured it, it would lose its power. The cave was waiting. Inside, it was colder than before. The air buzzed faintly, like static just beyond hearing. I turned the recorder on. August 24th, 2100 hours, I whispered, documenting evidence near Camp Morrow. My voice sounded hollow in the replay, distant, almost reluctant. Then something shifted behind me, a faint scrape, stone against stone. I turned and saw light, not from my lamp, a dull blue glow seeping through a crack in the wall, pulsing slowly like a heartbeat. I walked toward it. The glow brightened with each step until I could make out shapes inside the rock, indentations, moving shadows, faces, dozens of them pressed against the stone as if frozen mid-scream, their eyes open, their mouths closed. The air vibrated, my ears filled with pressure. The recorder in my hand clicked, then stopped, and beneath the sound of my own pulse, I heard it. The humming again, closer now, no longer through the tunnel, but all around me. It wasn't a song. It was words, low, rhythmic, patient. You remember. You remember. You remember. My vision blurred. I don't remember leaving the cave. I just remember waking up outside, lying in the dirt with the recorder still in my hand. It was morning. My car was a mile away. When I finally played the tape, it was blank, except for 3 knocks. Slow. Even. And then my own voice whispering back, listen. I don't tell this story to frighten people from the woods. The forest isn't evil. It's ancient. It keeps what it's given. Sometimes that means bones, sometimes voices, sometimes memories. Maybe it just wants to be remembered too. These days, I still patrol the same mountains, but I don't take my radio anymore. I don't camp near caves. And when night falls and the trees begin to sway, I sit quietly and let the silence speak. Because I've learned that silence isn't emptiness, it's presence. And sometimes when I close my eyes, I swear I hear something breathing just beneath the earth, not threatening, just waiting. The woods don't forget, they don't forgive. They just listen. There's something about the forest at dawn, the way the light filters through in fractured bands, soft and silver, before it burns away the night. On most mornings, that sight used to bring me calm. It reminded me why I stayed in this job so long, why I gave up a life of cities and company and noise. But lately, even the sunrise feels different. The light seems thinner, and sometimes it bends wrong, like it's refracting through something unseen. It's been almost a year since the cave incident. I never told the Bureau the truth. They think I suffered a minor fall and a concussion. Maybe it's easier that way. Easier to believe that fear has a rational cause, that the human mind is fragile and prone to tricks. But what I've experienced doesn't feel like a trick. It feels deliberate. Over the months, I started to notice something subtle but consistent, objects moving when I wasn't there. My field knife appearing on the porch instead of in my pack. My boots turned to face the woods each morning. Small things, but they carried a message I couldn't quite name. And then there were the knocks again. Always 3, always when I was alone. I began recording them out of habit, a form of self-preservation. The tapes are filled with static, wind, creaks, nothing definitive. But every so often there's a faint whisper buried deep in the noise, like breath against the microphone. It doesn't sound like a voice from outside. It sounds like one from within. I tried to tell myself I was slipping, that solitude and sleeplessness were twisting the edges of my perception. But then something happened that took all my rationalizations and buried them for good. Late October. The air was sharp enough to taste. I was stationed near Miller's Crossing, where an old ranger cabin had recently collapsed. My job was to assess the damage, mark it for cleanup, and make sure no one was using it for shelter. When I arrived, the site was quiet, untouched except for one thing, a single lantern still standing upright on the porch, flame flickering though there was no fuel inside. That detail shouldn't have been possible. Yet there it was, a small orange flame swaying in the still air. I should have turned back then. I didn't. Inside, the cabin smelled of decay, damp wood and something metallic beneath it. The walls were covered in graffiti, old carvings overlapping newer ones. Most were names, initials, dates, but on the far wall, etched deeper than the rest, was a phrase. He took them back. The words crawled under my skin. I walked toward the window, flashlight sweeping the floor, and froze. There were boot prints in the dust, fresh ones. Large. Barely human. They circled the room, stopping right where I stood. Then, from behind the cabin, came that low, rhythmic hum. It wasn't wind. It wasn't an animal. It was the same sound I'd heard in the cave, distant yet near, rising and falling like something drawing breath. The flame in the lantern flickered harder, bending toward the sound. I stepped back, my chest tightened, my flashlight dimmed. I heard footsteps then, heavy, measured, approaching from the tree line. The boards beneath my feet vibrated with each impact. I backed toward the door, slow yet quiet, heart pounding so loud I could feel it in my teeth. When I stepped outside, the forest was darker than it should have been for mid-afternoon. The clouds had rolled in silently, thick and low. I aimed my light at the edge of the woods, and that's when I saw it, tall, broad, standing completely still among the trees. Not human, but shaped like one. Its skin, or what looked like skin, was the color of ash. Its eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the beam of my light but not recoiling from it. It was watching me. The worst part wasn't its size or the way its limbs bent slightly wrong. It was the stillness. Predators move. They twitch, breathe, blink. This thing didn't. It just existed as though the forest itself had formed it to fill a space where light refused to go. I couldn't move, couldn't even speak. Every part of me was locked in the primitive understanding that I was prey. Then, without sound, it took one step forward. The ground beneath it didn't shift. The snow didn't crunch. It was like it slid through the world rather than walking across it. I turned and ran. Branches whipped at my face as I tore through the brush, half blind, lungs screaming. Behind me, nothing chased, but I felt it there. A pressure that filled every shadow, every pause in my breath. When I finally reached my truck, I didn't look back. I just drove as far as the road would take me until the trees thinned and the sky opened again. When I reported the site later, the location didn't exist in our system. The GPS coordinates looped back to an empty sector. No cabin, no trail, nothing. I went back with another ranger 2 days later. We found only a clearing, no structure, no debris. The ground looked untouched, covered in fresh snow. He laughed it off. I didn't. Since then, I've stopped trying to explain it. I've come to understand something I never wanted to admit. The forest is not a place. It's a memory. It holds on to what happens within it, echoes of sound, fragments of thought, imprints of fear, and sometimes, when you stay long enough, it gives those things shape. Maybe that's what I saw. Maybe it wasn't a creature at all, but fear itself, solidified, reflected back through the wood's ancient mind. I think about that often, especially on quiet nights when the air feels thick and the trees stand too still. Sometimes I'll catch my reflection in the cabin window, and for a heartbeat, it doesn't look like me. The eyes are too pale, the mouth is wrong, and when the knocking comes again, 3 slow, patient knocks, I don't answer anymore, I just listen. Because maybe that's all it ever wanted. Not to harm, not to chase, just to be heard. You learn, eventually, that some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. They exist to remind us that we're not in control, that the wilderness doesn't end at the tree line. It stretches inward through memory, through fear, through the parts of ourselves that still belong to something older. I still walk those woods, I still do my job. But every so often, when the fog drifts low and the pines bend under the weight of the wind, I hear it. A hum, a whisper, a voice that says softly, almost kindly, remember. And I do. I always will. Because some stories don't end. They just wait in the dark, breathing quietly, until someone else is foolish enough to listen. I still remember the sound that started it all. Thin, brittle, and cutting through the forest air like a strand of glass snapping in the dark. It wasn't the kind of scream that made you think someone was being attacked. It was the kind that made you question if it was even human. When I first heard it, I froze mid-step, my flashlight grazing over pine trunks slick with dew. The night was too quiet before it happened, too still for any kind of noise to make sense. I told myself it was just a fox. That's the first lie every ranger tells themselves in the woods, that what they heard was something ordinary. But deep down, I knew I hadn't heard anything ordinary that night. I had heard something wrong. My name's Tyler, and I've been a park ranger for almost 15 years. I work in the Klamath National Forest, tucked in the northern corner of California, where the fog hangs low and the forest floor feels alive. When people think of being a ranger, they imagine something peaceful, patrolling the trails, talking to campers, keeping an eye on wildlife. And yeah, there's that. But there's also the quiet, the kind that presses against you, fills your head until your thoughts echo, the kind that makes every twig snap sound like a whisper from behind. Over the years, I've seen my share of strange things out here. I found shoes in places no one should have reached, tents torn from the inside with no blood or tracks around them, campfires still warm beside sleeping bags that were zipped closed and empty. You learn to rationalize. You have to. That's what keeps you sane. Maybe they got lost, maybe they panicked, maybe an animal dragged something off. There's always an explanation, until there isn't. The first time the screaming started, it was early autumn. The park was thinning out, fewer tourists, more silence. The air had that bite that makes the forest smell sharper, more alive. I was stationed at an old service cabin about 10 miles from the nearest main road. My shift that week was night patrol, which meant I had to check the old logging paths for trespassers and illegal campers. It's easy work until it isn't. Around midnight, I caught a faint call over the radio. Someone thought they saw a flickering light at the Iron Creek campsite, a part of the park that had been closed for months due to erosion. I sighed, packed my thermos, and started the drive up. It was the kind of place that felt wrong even in daylight. The soil there never held still, always shifting underfoot like it wanted to bury you a little deeper with each step. When I reached the access road, I parked the truck and walked the last mile in. The forest was thick with fog, the beam of my flashlight swallowed after a few feet, and that's when I heard it, thin and distant at first. A scream that tore through the silence, cracked and trembling. I froze. My radio hissed softly, but there were no other voices. "Hello?" I called out. My voice sounded smaller than I expected. The scream didn't come again, but I could feel where it had come from, the direction. The air shifted subtly, colder, heavier. I started toward it, my boots crunching through the wet pine needles. I kept telling myself, someone was in trouble. That's what I'm trained to do. But with every step, a different thought kept slipping in. What if it's something that wants me to think that? When I reached the Iron Creek clearing, I saw the remains of a campsite. A single tent, unzipped, swaying slightly in the night air. A lantern was hanging from a branch, flickering weakly, though I couldn't hear any wind. I called out again, louder this time. "Ranger service? Anyone here?" Nothing. I approached the tent and crouched beside it. Inside, there was a sleeping bag, half unrolled, a boot lying on its side, and a small cooler. Everything looked lived in, but the air felt untouched, stale, still. I reached out and touched the fabric of the sleeping bag. It was damp, but warm. Someone had been there. Then the scream came again. Closer. It came from the woods just beyond the clearing. I swung my flashlight toward the sound, but the beam caught only fog and black trees. It was unmistakably human this time, but wrong. The pitch shifted halfway through, like it was coming from more than one throat. I took a step forward before something deep in me said not to. My instincts, the ones I'd ignored too many times before, whispered, "Back away." So I did. I retreated to my truck, my breath coming fast, forcing myself to rationalize. Maybe it was an animal, maybe someone playing a prank, but that tent, that warmth, someone had just been there. When I got back to the station around 3 a.m., I wrote my report but left out the scream. You don't put things like that in writing. People talk. Supervisors start checking your mental health. Rangers who talk about voices or screams don't stay on duty long. So I said I found an abandoned camp, packed up the gear, and drove back. But all night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been watched. A few days later, a man came into the ranger office asking about his brother, said he was camping near Iron Creek and hadn't come home. The name matched the permit we found in the tent. I told him we'd start a search, though we both knew how these things usually ended. The search took 3 days. We found no tracks, no sign of struggle, no footprints leading away. It was like the man had vanished from where he sat. But on the second night, while the search team slept, I heard it again, that same scream, faint and distant, rolling through the trees. I went outside my tent and looked into the darkness. No one else stirred. I should have called it in. I should have told someone. But something inside me, some deep animal instinct, kept me quiet. The scream wasn't calling for help. It was calling to me. And over the next few weeks, I started to dream about it. I'd wake in the middle of the night sweating, heart pounding, hearing that sound in my ears. Sometimes in my dreams, I saw a shape crouched just beyond the light of the fire, tall, too tall, its arms bending the wrong way. It never moved. It just watched. Then, one night, I woke to the sound outside my cabin. A crunch of gravel, slow steps. I sat up, hand instinctively reaching for my flashlight. The steps stopped right at my door. For a full minute, there was nothing but silence. Then, faintly, a dragging sound like someone running their hand across the wood. I didn't move. And then a whisper. Just one word, breathless and wrong. Help. I waited until dawn before stepping outside. Nothing. No tracks. No signs. But on the porch railing, I saw handprints, large, elongated, pressed deep into the damp wood. That was the first time I truly believed the stories the locals told. They called it the Watcher of Klamath. Some said it was a man who got lost in the woods decades ago, a ranger who went mad and never came out. Others said it was older than that, something that lived beneath the trees long before we called it a forest. Whatever it was, I knew it was watching. And over time, it began to follow. The next time it happened, it was during a storm. One of those violent mountain storms that rolls in fast and doesn't leave until it's torn through everything soft and alive. I was stationed at the northern post near Shasta Trinity, assigned to monitor trail closures due to flooding. The rain had been steady all day, sheets of it drumming on the tin roof of the ranger cabin, the kind of relentless rhythm that works its way into your heartbeat until you can't tell which one is yours. I was sitting by the radio, logging reports, when I heard it again, faint but unmistakable, the scream. It carried through the rain like a ghost in the static, distant but clear. The same tone, the same human but not sound. I froze, staring at the radio, half expecting to hear another ranger call it in. Nothing, just the hiss of white noise and the soft patter of rain on glass. My skin prickled cold. I went to the window and looked out at the tree line. Lightning flashed far off, painting the forest in a stark, white glare. For just a second, I thought I saw something tall move between the trees. Not a bear. Not a man. Something else. Something that didn't belong to the rhythm of the storm. My breath fogged the glass. I blinked, and it was gone. I tried to shake it off. Wrote it off as stress, as a trick of the light. But the scream had been too familiar. You can't mistake a sound like that once you've heard it. It burrows into you like a melody that plays when everything else goes silent. I didn't sleep that night. I just sat by the fire, staring at the door, waiting for the sound of gravel again, waiting for the voice that said help. It never came. But in the morning, I found something hanging from the porch light, a piece of torn fabric soaked through and dripping. Park-issued khaki, my color, my uniform. That was when I stopped dismissing the stories. One of the older rangers, Bill, had been working this area for 30 years. He had that steady look of a man who'd seen too much and learned to keep it buried. I asked him one afternoon, while we were marking a fallen trail, if he'd ever heard screaming out there. He stopped, mid-swing of his axe, and gave me this long, unreadable stare. "You hear that, huh?" he said after a while. His tone wasn't surprised. It was resigned. "Yeah," I admitted. "At Iron Creek, and again near here last night, it sounded like someone was in trouble." Bill nodded slowly, leaned on the handle of his axe, and sighed. "You won't find anyone. Never do. They say it's the woods calling back what belongs to it." I frowned. What's that supposed to mean? He looked past me, into the line of trees that bordered the clearing. Perhaps these forests have their own kind of memory. They remember what we take. Sometimes they take back. He wouldn't say anything else. But later, as we packed up, he handed me a small charm made of cedar and twine. Old thing the Kuruk used to hang near their lodges. Keeps the noise out. I kept it in my jacket pocket after that, not because I believed in it, but because part of me wanted to. Over the next few months, the park felt different. Not all at once, just little things. The birds stopped singing earlier. The wind would shift directions mid-blow. Sometimes, when I walked the trails, I'd find fresh footprints in the mud that were too big to be human, too wide for bear, and ended abruptly as if whatever made them simply lifted out of the earth and disappeared. One morning, a camper came in pale as chalk. Said he'd been hiking near the old fire road when he saw a man standing on a ridge above him. Said the man looked just like one of us, a ranger, uniform and all, but that his face was wrong. He said the man was smiling too wide, like his mouth didn't know where to stop. I went out there myself, searching for prints or signs of anyone, but the only thing I found was a ranger badge embedded in the mud. Old style, corroded, from a design that hadn't been used in 50 years. I started losing sleep again. Started hearing the scream at odd hours, not always outside, sometimes faintly behind me when I worked late at the station. I'd turn, and the air would feel heavier, like something invisible had just stepped away. Then, one night, it happened again, but different this time. I was driving back from the southern perimeter near the river, the fog thick enough to smear the headlights into white haze. I saw a flicker of orange through the trees, like a campfire. An instinct took over. Fires meant risk. Campers where they shouldn't be, or worse. I pulled over, grabbed my flashlight, and started down the embankment. The smell hit me first, wet earth and something metallic underneath it. I stepped into the clearing, and there it was, campsite. Empty, but fresh. Tent, fire ring, gear. The embers were still glowing faintly red, hissing in the mist. And then, the scream. Louder than ever. Right behind me. I spun, light slicing through the fog, and for a split second, I saw her. A woman, pale and gaunt, standing between the trees. Her clothes were torn, her eyes wide and hollow. Her mouth opened again, and the sound that came out wasn't from her lungs. It was from the woods themselves. I stumbled back, tripping over a rock, falling hard. My flashlight rolled away, its beam cutting across her feet, and that's when I saw it. Her legs weren't moving. They weren't attached. Her form was just hanging there, half visible, the rest fading into the dark. Then, as fast as it appeared, it was gone. The forest went still. Even the rain had stopped. I sat there for what felt like an hour before I could stand. When I finally did, the campsite looked different, older. The tent was shredded, the fire ring overgrown with moss, like it had been there for years. I didn't tell anyone what I saw. Not because I was afraid they'd think I was crazy, because I was afraid they wouldn't. When I got back that night, I checked the old incident logs. There it was. Iron Creek, 15 years ago. A missing woman. Camper, mid-30s. Never found. The photo matched the face I'd seen in the fog. That's when I started to wonder if the watcher wasn't what I thought it was. Maybe it wasn't a single thing at all. Maybe it was a place, a hunger, the forest itself, and I think it had started to recognize me. I began to notice the changes slowly. Too slowly to admit they were real at first. The forest didn't just feel different anymore. It sounded different. I'd step outside my cabin at night and realize the rhythm of crickets was off. It wasn't random. It had become organized, patterned, like something trying to mimic sound, trying to talk in its own way. The silences grew longer between those chirps, stretched so wide you could feel the emptiness pressing against your skin. I remember one evening standing at the edge of the old fire road as the fog rolled in. It was the kind of fog that seemed to carry sound strangely. You could hear whispers of things too far away to make sense. Somewhere beyond the timberline, I heard what I thought was a man calling my name. My name. It echoed once, faint and uncertain, as though carried on water. I shouted back, thinking maybe a hiker was lost, but there was no reply. Just the low groan of trees bending under the wind. That's the thing about this forest. It plays tricks on you, especially when you've spent enough nights in it alone. You start hearing what you need to hear. Voices that sound like home. Laughter that feels familiar. Sometimes you follow it, sometimes you don't come back. But what shook me most wasn't the sound. It was the smell. That next week, the air around my cabin began to carry this faint, metallic tang. It reminded me of blood, but sharper, colder. It was strongest just before dawn, like something nearby was rusting in the ground. The scent would drift in through the window and wake me before the sun did. I'd go outside, expecting to find an animal carcass nearby, maybe a deer dragged too close, but there was never anything. Just the fog, the pines, and that smell clinging to the air like breath. Then one morning I found the prints again. They were right outside the cabin this time. Half a dozen of them sunk deep into the soil. Bigger than human, toes too long, the spacing unnatural. But what froze me wasn't their shape. It was that they circled the cabin perfectly, all facing inward, like something had been walking around and around me while I slept. I should have reported it. I should have called Bill or the main ranger station, but fear has a way of shrinking your world until all that exists is you and the thing you're afraid of. You start to believe that if you stay quiet, maybe it'll stay quiet too. That night, I sat up with the lights on. The clock hit 2:14 a.m. when I heard the first sound, 3 slow knocks on the wall outside. Not hard, just a soft, deliberate tap, 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 like knuckles on hollow wood. Then silence. My breath hitched. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it toward the door, but before I could move, the knocking came again. This time on the opposite side of the cabin. Tap, tap, tap. Whatever it was moving, circling. I didn't open the door, I didn't even breathe. The knocking stopped after a minute, but I could hear something shifting in the dirt just outside, slow, dragging steps. And then a voice. Faint, almost pleading. Tyler. That was all it said. My name, drawn out and wrong, as if spoken by someone who had learned to form words but didn't understand their weight. I turned off the lights. I don't know why. Maybe I thought it would help me see whatever was outside. Maybe I wanted to disappear. But when the cabin fell into darkness, I saw it through the window. A silhouette, tall and narrow, standing just beyond the tree line. Not moving, just there, watching. It stayed like that for what felt like hours. The rain started again sometime before dawn, and when I finally found the courage to open the door, there was nothing there. Only the faint scent of metal and wet earth. I took the next few days off, told the supervisor I was feeling burned out. They didn't ask questions. Everyone burns out eventually out here. I packed up and drove south, all the way to Redding. Spent a night in a motel just to sleep without the sound of trees creaking around me. But even there, in the hum of the air conditioner and the distant sound of cars, I kept hearing faint knocks against the walls. That was when I realized something I didn't want to admit. It wasn't the forest that was haunted anymore. It was me. I came back a week later. You can't stay away from the woods when they've been part of you that long. It's like leaving a piece of your body behind. Bill was waiting at the outpost when I arrived. He looked at me like he already knew. "You heard it again, didn't you?" he asked quietly. I didn't answer. He handed me a thermos of coffee and said, "There's something you need to see." We hiked up toward the high ridge that overlooked Iron Creek. It had been months since anyone was allowed up there. Erosion had made the trail unstable. The air was damp and heavy, and the deeper we went, the more I felt that strange pressure in my ears again, like the forest was humming just below hearing range. When we reached the ridge, Bill stopped. He pointed toward a cave I'd never noticed before, half covered by moss and rock slide. "They say the first ranger disappeared in there," he said, "back before the park had a name. Locals used to call it the Cave of Voices." He told me that during storms, you could hear people calling from inside, voices of the lost. The forest didn't just take them, it kept them, echoed them. I don't know why I went in. Maybe I had to see it. Maybe I already knew I'd hear something waiting. The air inside was cold and slick with moisture, every sound bouncing off the walls. My flashlight beam trembled as I walked deeper, the stones swallowing the light in shades of gray and black. The smell was stronger here, that same metallic tang, multiplied. Then I heard it. Not a scream this time, a whisper. Dozens of them, layered, twisting around each other like wind. My name, over and over. Some voices I didn't recognize, and one that I did. The missing woman from Iron Creek, and beneath all of it, a deeper sound. A breath. I turned to leave, but the light flickered, and for one moment the beam caught something on the wall. Handprints, hundreds of them, pressed deep into the stone, some small, some large, all reaching upward like they were trying to climb out. Then, from the dark behind me, something moved. A shape, taller than any man, its head almost scraping the cave ceiling. The air around it bent, warped like heat over asphalt. And when it spoke, it didn't sound like one voice. It sounded like many. "Stay." I ran. I don't remember how I got out. I only remember falling against the rocks outside, gasping for air, the world spinning around me. Bill was gone. His footprints ended right at the cave's mouth. And when I looked back one last time, I saw a single light flicker inside, like a lantern swinging in slow circles. I never saw Bill again. They said he must have fallen into one of the sinkholes nearby. But I know what I saw. The forest took him, like it takes everything that tries to understand it. Now, years later, I still patrol these woods. I still hear the screams sometimes, especially on storm nights when the fog rolls low. People go missing, and I file the reports, same as always. But I never go near Iron Creek anymore, because sometimes when I'm alone, I still hear it, the tapping on my cabin walls, and a voice, low and familiar, whispering just beneath my breath, "Help me." Only now it sounds like Bill. And sometimes, when I listen closely enough, it sounds like me. There are nights when I wake up without knowing why, heart pounding, breath shallow, sweat clinging to my neck, and for a few seconds, I don't know if I'm in my cabin or still inside that cave. The air feels too heavy. The shadows move too slowly. Sometimes I swear I can still hear that whispering, like the cave followed me out, carrying the breath of everything it had stolen. I've tried to tell myself it's just stress or guilt or some buried echo that my mind refuses to silence. But deep down, I know better. The forest doesn't forget those who've stepped into its mouth. It marks you quietly, patiently, like sap bleeding through bark. A month after Bill disappeared, I got reassigned temporarily to the Southern District. They said it was for my own good. A change of scenery, less isolation, fewer memories. But even there, 200 miles away from Iron Creek, I couldn't escape it. The trees looked different, but the silence was the same. The same weight in the air before sunset. The same strange hush that spread whenever the wind stopped. One night, a volunteer named Carla joined me on patrol. She was young, new to the service, full of that quiet excitement that reminded me of what I used to feel when the woods still felt like home. We were checking an area near the Red River Basin, remote, dense, hard to access even by the old ranger roads. The trail wound through a series of old-growth pines, their roots gnarled like bones. About 2 miles in, we found a campsite, unauthorized but harmless at first glance. A small tent, a burned-out fire pit, and a few scattered supplies. But what made me stop was the smell, that faint, metallic scent again. The same one that had followed me since Iron Creek. Carla noticed it too. "Smells like rust," she said. I nodded but said nothing. My flashlight beam caught something in the dirt. A footprint, but deep, too deep, as though whatever made it had sunk straight down instead of walking. Then I noticed more of them. A circle, just like before. "Tyler," Carla whispered. "What is that?" Before I could answer, a sound cut through the stillness. Not a scream this time, but a long, low exhale, like wind forced through a narrow throat. It came from the direction of the river. My stomach dropped. "Stay here," I said, though I knew it was useless advice. I followed the sound, stepping carefully through the undergrowth, the beam of my flashlight catching flashes of movement that dissolved when I turned toward them. The air grew colder, my breath visible. And then, through the trees, I saw light, a faint pulsing glow reflecting off the river's surface. It looked like a lantern swinging back and forth just above the waterline. I stepped closer, but the ground beneath me felt soft, spongy, like it was breathing. My boots sank an inch, then two. That metallic scent grew stronger, and then I heard Carla's voice behind me. But something was wrong. "Tyler," she called, but her tone was flat, hollow. Not afraid, not curious, just empty. I turned, and for a second my heart stopped. Carla was standing at the edge of the clearing, her body still, her arms at her sides. But her eyes, they were wide, unblinking, and reflecting the lantern's glow. She looked like she was listening to something just out of my hearing range. "Carla?" I said. She didn't move, didn't blink. Then, in a voice that wasn't hers, layered and low, she whispered, "It's calling." I lunged toward her, grabbed her shoulders, shook her, but she didn't react. Her skin was cold to the touch, and the longer I held her, the colder I became. The light from the river flared, and in it I saw shapes rising just beneath the surface, pale, distorted, swaying like they were suspended in the current. Hands, faces, eyes. I pulled her back hard away from the water, and as soon as her foot left the riverbank, she gasped, like someone had cut her free from being held underwater. She blinked rapidly, eyes wild with confusion. "What happened?" she asked, trembling. "You almost walked into the river," I said. My voice shook. "You were." I stopped myself. I couldn't explain what I'd seen. Couldn't explain them. We left everything. The tent, the footprints, the glow, and hiked back in silence. She didn't speak again until we reached the truck. "You heard it too, didn't you?" she asked quietly. I didn't answer. That night, as I sat in my cabin, I replayed everything. The circle of prints, the voice, the cold. I tried to rationalize it again, the way I used to. Gases from the river, a trick of light, shared hysteria. But none of those explanations accounted for the smell, or the prints, or the way the trees seemed to lean closer every time I tried to sleep. A few days later, Carla quit. No notice. No goodbye. She packed her things and disappeared. They said she went back to Oregon, but I never saw her name come up again in any of the ranger reports. And for a while, I thought maybe that was it. Maybe whatever followed me had finally found someone else. But then the knocking started again. This time, it wasn't on my cabin walls. It was from beneath the floorboards. Slow, deliberate, like something trying to remember the rhythm of a heartbeat. I moved out the next morning, but even now, years later, I still hear it sometimes when I camp alone. That faint tapping in the soil beneath me. The smell of iron in the rain. The whisper threading through the wind asking for help in voices that don't belong to anyone living. And sometimes when I walk the perimeter trails before dawn, I swear I see a lantern moving through the trees. Always ahead of me, always just out of reach. I used to think the forest wanted to scare me, but now I understand. It doesn't want to be feared, it wants to be remembered. Because everything that disappears here, every scream, every echo, every breath, doesn't vanish. It stays. It becomes part of the soil, part of the air, part of the night itself. And when the wind passes through just right, if you listen close enough, you can hear them calling. Not out of malice, not even out of pain, just so they won't be forgotten. And maybe deep down, that's why I still patrol these woods, because somewhere in that chorus of lost voices, I can still hear my own. Sometimes I wonder if the forest has a heart. If somewhere, beneath all the roots and stone, it keeps the pulse of everything it's ever taken. A rhythm we can't quite hear until we've been here too long. Because after enough nights alone in this place, you start to move in time with it. Your steps fall quieter. Your breathing matches the wind. You stop being a visitor, and the woods start letting you in. It's strange how easily fear turns into acceptance. I stopped jumping at the noises outside my cabin long ago. The tapping, the whispering, even the screams, they've become part of the landscape, like the groan of the pines or the rush of the creek after rain. They're not intrusions anymore. They're reminders. But every now and then something new happens, something that reminds me I don't understand this place. Not really. It was early spring the year after Carla vanished. The snow was just beginning to melt, and the trails were opening again. I was reassigned back north, close to Iron Creek. I didn't argue. Maybe part of me wanted to face it again, the source of it all. The drive up felt heavier this time. The forest looked older, the trees thicker, darker, almost as if the entire landscape had been reshaped while I was gone. The old ranger cabin stood where it always had, but the wood had warped. The door sagged on its hinges. I could see the faint outline of the handprints still burned into the porch railing, silvered now with age. That night, I built a fire behind the cabin and sat listening to the crackle of it. The forest around me was quiet in that deceptive way, as if it were holding its breath. The air smelled faintly of pine and rain and something else beneath it, faint but familiar, metallic. I don't know how long I sat there before I noticed it. The sound of something moving just beyond the edge of the firelight. Not walking, crawling, slow, deliberate. I stood up, my flashlight trembling slightly in my grip. "Who's there?" The movement stopped. Silence. Then, from the dark, a shape began to emerge. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer. But as it stepped into the light, my stomach turned. It was wearing a ranger's jacket. Faded. Torn. The same kind we'd worn a decade ago. Its face was hidden behind a veil of hair matted with mud. But the way it stood, I knew that posture. "Bill?" I whispered. The figure tilted its head slightly, like it recognized the name. Then it took another step forward, and I saw its hands, long, blackened at the fingertips, the skin split and crusted with something dark. I took a step back, heart hammering. The figure stopped, head twitching slightly, like it was struggling to remember how to move. And then, in that same layered, distorted voice I'd heard in the cave, it spoke. "Tyler, stay." Every muscle in my body screamed to run, but my feet wouldn't move. The fire crackled louder, the light flickering across its face, and for the briefest instant I saw it. His eyes, they were Bill's, but behind them something else was staring back, something vast and ancient, using his face like a mask. "Bill," I said, my voice breaking. "What happened to you?" The figure opened its mouth, and the scream poured out, not from its throat, but from the trees, the ground, the air itself. Every scream I'd ever heard in this forest, all at once. I stumbled backward, the fire collapsing in a shower of sparks, the light dying. In that darkness, I heard the rustle of movement all around me. Not one. Dozens. Whispering, breathing, calling my name. When I came to, it was dawn. The fire was out. The ground around me was covered in handprints, pressed deep into the soil, circling where I had stood. There was no sign of Bill. I left the cabin that day, drove down the mountain until the trees thinned and the world felt like it belonged to people again. I sat in the parking lot of a gas station for hours, staring at my reflection in the window. And I realized something that's never left me since. It doesn't follow you out of the forest. It waits for you to return. Every ranger learns that lesson eventually, whether they admit it or not. You can leave the woods, but the woods don't leave you. They remember your scent, your voice, your heart. They keep a place for you, open and waiting, like a grave that hasn't yet been filled. And no matter how far you go, you'll hear it. That faint calling when the wind moves just right, when you pass a tree line at dusk and your shadow stretches too long behind you. Sometimes I think about Bill's words. The forest takes back what belongs to it. Maybe that's what's happening to me. Maybe I've spent too long walking its trails, breathing its air, pretending I was its keeper when I was only ever its guest. I still work the job, still wear the uniform, still tell campers to stay close to the marked trails and to pack out what they bring in. But every time I give that warning, I hear another voice in my head, low and distant, whispering the truth beneath my words. The forest doesn't forget. Last month, I was stationed near Black Elk Ridge, far from Iron Creek, but the land feels connected somehow. Same hum beneath the soil, same quiet pull. I was doing a routine sweep before closing the trails for the season when I found something lying by the creek. A lantern. Old, rusted, the glass fogged with soot. Inside, something small rattled when I picked it up. I unscrewed the base, and a folded piece of paper fell into my hand. There were only 3 words written on it. We are waiting. I stood there for a long time, the wind whispering through the trees, that metallic scent rising again like a memory resurfacing. And for the first time in years, I felt it, that pull in my chest, that quiet command that comes from somewhere deeper than fear. It wasn't telling me to run. It was telling me to come home. Even now, when the nights stretch long and the forest hums in that low, endless rhythm, I think about that cave, about Bill, about the faces I saw in the water and the screams that still echo in my dreams. And sometimes when I'm alone at the edge of Iron Creek, I swear I can hear the earth breathing beneath me, slow, deep, and patient. I know I should leave. I've told myself that 1,000 times, but I can't. Not yet. Because somewhere in the dark, something is still calling my name. And part of me wants to answer. Maybe that's how it starts for everyone who goes missing here. Maybe it's not fear that takes us. Maybe it's the longing to finally understand what's been whispering to us all along. And if that's true, then one day when someone hears screaming from an empty campsite, they'll come looking for me. They'll find my tent still warm, the lantern still swinging, and maybe if they listen closely, they'll hear my voice in the wind, calling out from somewhere deep in the trees. Not for help, but to say that I finally found what was waiting for me, and that it's been waiting for them too. The first time I heard the forest breathe, I thought it was just the wind. But you can tell the difference when you've worked among the redwoods long enough. What's air moving through leaves, and what's something older inhaling around you. The redwoods don't just stand still, they listen. You can feel it, like the whole forest is waiting for you to make the wrong sound. My name doesn't matter much anymore. The badge I wore, the uniform that once gave me purpose, they're somewhere beneath a canopy so thick the sunlight bends before it touches the ground. I worked as a ranger in Northern California for 12 years. I thought I'd seen it all. Lost hikers, overturned campers, even a few bodies that nature reclaimed before we found them. But nothing prepares you for what doesn't fit the pattern, for the moments when reason starts slipping from your grip. That's what happened in Redwood National and State Parks 2 winters ago. That year, storms came in waves, trees fell across the access roads, streams swelled into brown veins of debris, and the wind spoke through the trunks like voices trying to remember their own language. I'd been stationed near an old service cabin just off Bald Hills Road. It was a remote outpost, mostly used for logging inspections decades back, now a kind of unofficial base for rangers on long shifts. It had 1 radio, 1 cot, and enough room for a coffee thermos and a notebook. When the missing reports started coming in, they didn't sound unusual. Hikers gone off trail, maybe lost when the fog rolled in. Redwood is like that. Everything looks the same when the mist closes around you. But there was a pattern I couldn't ignore. Every disappearance happened within a stretch of forest near an unmarked trailhead north of Oric. Locals called it the Hollow Mile. No one had named it on any official map. But when I mentioned it on the radio, an older ranger named Craig went quiet for a long time before saying, "Don't let that place under your skin." He didn't explain. He didn't need to. The Hollow Mile wasn't supposed to exist. Yet, I found it anyway. It started with a sound, something like wood knocking in the distance. It was rhythmic, steady, almost deliberate. 3 knocks, a pause, then 2 more. I followed it through the undergrowth, boots crunching on ferns slick with rain, until I came to a clearing where the sound just stopped. No birds, no wind, just silence deep enough to feel in my teeth. And then a smell. Not rot, not death, something colder, wet metal. The scent of iron mixed with moss yaft as if the forest had opened a wound. That's where I found the cave. It wasn't much more than a slit between two boulders, half hidden by ferns and roots. But when I leaned in, the air coming out of it was wrong, warm, pulsing, as though something alive was breathing beneath the ground. I marked it on my map and told myself I'd report it later. That's what protocol demanded. But I didn't. I couldn't. Something about that cave drew me back. The next day, I returned alone. The forest was drenched from overnight rain, the soil soft enough to swallow a boot heel. I noticed tracks near the cave, bare footprints, long strides, the impressions deep like someone heavier than a man had passed through. They led in, not out. I called it in. The dispatcher laughed it off, said I'd been up there too long, that shadows play tricks on you in the redwoods. She told me to get some rest. But when I went back to the cabin, the air smelled of that same metallic scent. My radio crackled once that night, a voice too faint to make out. I could have sworn it said my name. I didn't sleep. The next morning, I found Craig's truck parked beside the service road. Doors unlocked, keys still in the ignition. His pack was gone, but his hat lay in the passenger seat, soaked through. I called it in again, this time with urgency, but the radio only hissed. I drove my ATV down to the ranger station myself, a 20-mile ride through mud and mist, only to find the station empty. Coffee cups half drunk, lights flickering, no one around. It felt like walking into the aftermath of something, like everyone had left in a hurry. That's when I saw it, on the corkboard above the check-in logs. A map of the forest, but someone had circled the hollow mile in red marker over and over until the paper tore through. Written beside it were 3 words, "He's still calling." When I went back to the cabin that night, I knew I wasn't alone. I could hear the knocks again, louder this time, coming not from outside, but from beneath the floorboards. I tried to tell myself it was the wind shifting the foundation or water moving through old pipes, but then I heard something else. Breathing. Slow, deliberate, matching my own rhythm until I stopped to listen. And it didn't. I packed my gear and left, hiking toward the hollow mile with my flashlight shaking in my hand. Each beam of light caught flakes of mist like dust in a cathedral, and somewhere in the dark, something moved between the trunks. It wasn't fast. It wasn't hiding. It just watched. At first, I thought it was a bear, massive, hunched, and silent. But bears don't stand upright that long, and they don't mimic the sound of your own footsteps. The thing followed me for a mile. Every time I stopped, it stopped. When I turned my light behind me, there was only mist, but I could hear its breath, deep, animal, and almost human. By the time I reached the cave again, my chest was tight with fear and something else, curiosity. I wanted to know what had taken Craig, what had taken the others, maybe even what had taken me, piece by piece, since the first time I smelled that metallic air. I stepped inside. The walls were slick, pulsating faintly, as if the cave itself was breathing. The deeper I went, the more it felt like being swallowed. My light flickered. The ground sloped downward, and I began to hear whispers, low, hoarse, like people speaking through water. I caught fragments of words, lost, below, still waiting. Something brushed my shoulder. I swung my light around, but there was no one. Only the faint impression of a handprint on the stone, long fingers, wider than mine. I don't remember what happened next. Not clearly. The light went out, and I fell. The whispers became screams echoing through my head like wind through hollow wood. When I woke up, I was outside, lying face down in the mud, my map torn, the cave gone. There was no trace of it, no opening, no footprints, not even disturbed leaves. It was as if the forest had swallowed its own secret. I tried to report it, but every time I said cave, the radio cut out. Every time I wrote about it in my logbook, the ink bled. I left the job 3 weeks later. I told myself I was done, but sometimes, when the wind moves through the trees just right, I still hear the knocks. 3, pause, 2. And I know Craig's still calling. That night, I stayed in a motel off Highway 101, somewhere near Klamath. The rain beat against the window like it was trying to get in, and every gust of wind made the building creak like old timber groaning under weight. I left the TV on just for noise, some fishing show flickering gray-blue light across the walls, but I couldn't focus. The radio was still in my pack, and I kept glancing at it, half expecting it to come alive again, to hear Craig's voice through that static. Instead, sometime after midnight, it crackled once, just once, and in between the hiss, I heard that same rhythm. 3 knocks, pause, 2 knocks. I turned the radio off and threw it into the bathroom sink. I wanted to pretend that was the end of it, that I could just drive away, forget it all, and go back to being someone who believed forests were beautiful, not watchful. But Redwood doesn't let you forget. In the morning, my windshield was covered in condensation, except for one patch near the driver's side. Someone had wiped it clean, and across the fogged glass, 5 long finger streaks trailed down, as if something had leaned close to look inside. I drove out of there faster than I should have. I told myself it was probably kids, maybe locals, who'd heard stories about rangers and missing hikers. But deep down, I knew what I'd seen. The streaks were too wide, the spacing too unnatural. I kept driving until I hit Crescent City. I went into the Ranger District office to file my final paperwork, resignation, termination, whatever they wanted to call it. The supervisor, a man named Harlow, looked like he'd already read the ending to my story. He didn't argue, didn't even ask why I was leaving, just handed me a clipboard and said, "You did what you could." When I asked him about Craig, he looked up from his desk. "Craig?" he repeated, voice flat. "You must be mistaken. No one by that name works here." That stopped me cold. I knew Craig. We'd shared campfire coffee, traded stories about storms and lost hikers, and complained about the endless rain. He was real. I told Harlow exactly that. He looked at me, expression unreadable, and said, "Rangers go missing sometimes. Not all of them come back." Then he folded my resignation form neatly and slid it into a drawer. "Go home," he added quietly, "before the forest remembers you." I should have listened, but home didn't feel safe anymore. The walls of my apartment were too still, too silent. The sound of silence after so many years of forest noise is deafening. I started sleeping with a fan on just to fill the space. But even then, sometimes I'd wake up and swear I could hear knocking again. So soft I couldn't tell if it was inside the wall or inside my head. Weeks passed like that. I drank more than I should have. Tried to tell people what happened, but it always came out wrong. Too strange. Too unbelievable. You start to sound like a lunatic when you say the forest breathed your name. Then one evening, a letter showed up. No return address. Inside was a small photograph, old, sun-faded, printed on matte paper. It showed the ranger cabin, the same one I'd stayed in, but the details were wrong. The trees looked younger, the clearing wider, and in front of the cabin stood 3 men in uniforms that looked decades out of date. One of them was Craig. On the back, written in shaky ink, "The Hollow Mile never forgets its rangers." That night I didn't sleep. The air in my apartment felt thick, heavy with the scent of wet moss and iron. The sound came again just before dawn, 3 knocks, pause, 2, but this time it wasn't from the walls. It was from my window. I froze, didn't move. My breath caught in my throat as I looked toward the glass. At first, nothing. Just darkness beyond the half-closed blinds. But then something shifted. A tall silhouette, motionless, almost human. It leaned forward slowly, and for a moment I could make out what looked like a face pressed against the glass. Except it wasn't a face. It was too stretched, too long, the skin pale and wet-looking, like bark that had never dried. And where the eyes should have been, there were hollow, dark pits reflecting the faint city light. When I turned on the lamp, it was gone. The glass was cold to the touch and smeared again with 5 long streaks. That was when I decided to go back. I had to see it again. To know if the cave, the knocks, Craig, all of it, were just the breakdown of a tired ranger's mind or something the forest had buried. I couldn't live with not knowing. So I packed what little I still trusted, a flashlight, my old uniform jacket, and a compass. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I drove through the night, back up 101 through the fog so thick it looked alive under the headlights. The road turned familiar the closer I got to Auric, the bends, the scent of salt and cedar, the endless, watching redwoods towering above. When I parked near the service road, everything was different. The gate was gone. The sign for the old logging trail had been ripped out, leaving only a scar in the earth. But the forest, God, the forest, looked older. The trunks were thicker, the moss darker, and even the air felt heavier, as though the place had aged centuries in months. I hiked in silence. No birds, no insects, nothing. Only the crunch of my boots and the slow beat of my heart. The deeper I went, the more I realized the forest didn't feel empty. It felt occupied. And then I heard it again. 3 knocks. Pause. 2. Coming from ahead this time. I followed the sound. My flashlight beam caught fragments of fog moving between the trees, swirling like breath. Then, out of nowhere, the smell hit me. The same one from before. Wet metal, iron, blood. And I saw it. The cave. Exactly where it had been before, even though the terrain should have swallowed it. The same narrow slit between 2 boulders, the same pulse of warm air drifting out. I stood there for a long time, afraid to step closer, afraid to look away. Then from inside, a voice called. Low, tired, and unmistakably human. It said my name. My first instinct was to run. Every cell in my body screamed for it. But the voice didn't sound like something that wanted to hurt me. It sounded desperate, thin, strained with the kind of fear that only comes from being left behind. It sounded like Craig. Hold on, I shouted into the cave, though my voice cracked halfway through. The sound bounced back at me, echoing until it was barely recognizable, each repetition bending the tone until it no longer sounded like me at all. I hesitated at the entrance. My flashlight trembled in my hand as I crouched and shined it into the black throat of the cave. The light reached about 10 feet in before being swallowed entirely. But I could still hear breathing, slow, uneven, wet, like lungs full of water. I ducked inside. Immediately, the air changed. Warm, humid, and thick with the smell of copper and earth. The ground beneath me wasn't stone anymore. It was soft, yielding slightly under my boots, like walking on thick moss or old flesh. I told myself it was soil, just dense with moisture, but I didn't believe it. My light flickered as I moved deeper. The walls glistened, slick and organic. I could see faint patterns, lines that resembled veins running through the rock, faintly pulsing as though carrying something alive through them. Every few steps I stopped to listen. The knocking rhythm had stopped now, replaced by that labored breathing somewhere ahead. Craig! I called again. It's me! No answer, just a whisper that didn't belong to the echo. It said, "It's been waiting." The voice was quiet, childlike almost, yet threaded with a rasp that scraped across my spine. I lifted my light higher. The tunnel widened into a chamber, and there, slumped against the far wall, was what looked like a ranger's jacket. My heart pounded so loud I could hear it in my ears. I moved closer, flashlight shaking across the uneven ground. It was Craig, or what was left of him. His face was pale, eyes open but unfocused. His skin looked wrong, grayish, with patches that seemed to merge with the wall behind him. The fabric of his jacket had fused into the stone like the cave was absorbing him inch by inch. When I reached out, his hand twitched. His lips parted, and his voice came out broken, almost mechanical. Don't. Stay long. I stumbled backward, tripping over a root that shouldn't have been there. My light fell, rolling toward him, and when it did, it illuminated something on the wall. Words carved deep into the stone as if clawed there by bare hands. He breathes through us. My chest tightened. I grabbed the flashlight, but when I looked back, Craig was gone. In his place, the wall had changed shape. Smooth, damp, and moving with the faint rhythm of a heartbeat. I bolted. The tunnel seemed to shift as I ran. Paths that had been clear seconds ago were suddenly blocked, the walls narrowing as if the cave itself was closing in. My light flickered, and in the strobe of each flash I saw shapes, tall figures half-formed standing along the edges watching. They didn't move, didn't chase. They just watched. And through it all, that breathing grew louder. By the time I reached the mouth of the cave, I could feel something at my back. Not touching, but pressing like air displaced by something vast. When I stumbled out into the rain, I didn't stop. I kept running until the forest thinned and the familiar hum of the road reached my ears. But the forest didn't let me leave clean. When I reached the truck, mud streaked across the windshield again, 5 long lines, dragging downward from the top of the glass. And in the reflection of the glass behind me, I thought I saw Craig standing between the trees. He wasn't calling anymore. He was just watching, head tilted slightly, his body swaying as if to some rhythm I couldn't hear. I started the engine and drove. I don't remember the road. I don't remember how I ended up back in Crescent City. I only remember the sound, the knocking, coming from the back of the truck, faint but steady. 3 knocks. Pause. 2. It stopped when I reached my apartment. For 3 nights after that, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that wall breathing. On the 4th night, I decided to go through my old Ranger logs to see if anything had mentioned the Hollow Mile before. There was one entry, dated 1963. The handwriting was old and rough, but the note was short. Open quote, "Patrol team failed to return. Area near unmarked cave sealed. Subject inside said to mimic human voice. Do not respond when called." Close quote. There were initials at the bottom. C.H. Harlow. The next morning, I went back to the Ranger office, though I knew I shouldn't. Harlow wasn't there. His desk was clean, drawers empty, nameplate gone. A young woman in uniform looked up when I asked about him and said, "There's no one here by that name, sir." I stood there, staring at the empty office. Something inside me broke then. Whatever belief I'd still had in reason, in facts, in the world working the way it used to. Because when I looked at the corkboard again, there was a new map pinned up. And someone had circled a new section in red ink. Not the Hollow Mile this time, farther south, near Oric Beach. Beside it, someone had written, "He's breathing again." That's when I realized it doesn't stop, it just moves. I left town that night, drove south for hours until the redwoods thinned into scrub and the fog finally lifted from the road. But even now, sometimes, when the night is quiet and the wind moves through the pines just right, I can still hear it. 3 knocks. Pause. 2. And when I close my eyes, I swear I feel the forest inhale. I didn't go back to work after that. Didn't even try. I sold the truck, packed what I could into a single duffel bag, and started drifting down the coast, sleeping in roadside motels, then in borrowed trailers, then in the back of a friend's old van when the money ran out. I told myself I was looking for peace, for distance, but the truth is I was running from a sound, those damned knocks that still found me in the middle of nowhere, muffled through thin walls or rusted doors. I began keeping notes again, just to prove to myself I wasn't losing it. Dates, times, locations. Every time I heard the rhythm, I'd mark it down. 3 knocks, pause. 2. At first, it happened every few nights, then once a week. Then months passed in silence, and I almost convinced myself it was over, until I met her. Her name was Lucy, a wildlife photographer from Eureka. She'd heard about my time as a ranger and wanted to document the hidden stories of the redwoods. She had that naive kind of curiosity, the kind that still believed every mystery was meant to be solved, every sound had a scientific explanation. I envied that about her. We met at a small diner near Trinidad, and I told her parts of my story. Not all of it. Just the disappearances, the rumors of caves, the old ranger named Craig who vanished. I left out the rest because even saying it aloud felt dangerous, like it might summon something. She listened, fascinated, jotting notes into a small leather journal. When I paused, she leaned forward and said, "You realize you're describing almost the exact same spot I found last week, right?" I froze. She pulled out her phone and showed me a photo, a dark slit in the side of a mossy embankment, framed by redwood roots like fingers gripping the soil. The light was low, filtered through fog, but I recognized it instantly. The cave. "No," I said, shaking my head. "That can't be. It was gone." Lucy smiled, thinking I was joking. "You sure?" "Because I marked the coordinates. It's near one of the unmaintained trails north of the old service cabin. Thought it might be part of an animal den system." My stomach turned. "You went inside?" "Just a few feet," she said. Didn't want to mess with the equipment until I had someone with me. I wanted to tell her to burn the camera, delete the photo, forget she'd ever seen that place. But something in me hesitated. Maybe it was guilt, Craig's voice still echoing somewhere in my head, or maybe it was that same pull the forest had over me before, the kind that whispers, "This time, you'll understand." So I agreed to go back with her. The next morning, we drove north along the fog-choked highway until the redwoods rose again like columns of an ancient temple. We parked at the turnout where the service road used to be, though now it was overgrown with ferns and thick roots that looked almost deliberate, like the forest itself was trying to seal the way shut. Lucy moved with the ease of someone who didn't yet believe in fear. Her laughter cut through the mist, bright and human, while mine stayed trapped somewhere in my chest. We hiked for nearly an hour before we found it. The same unnatural hush fell around us when we reached the clearing, the same breathless quiet that I remembered from that first time. And there it was again, the cave, smaller than before, as if shrinking to disguise itself. Lucy crouched beside the entrance, snapping photos. "You feel that?" she asked. "The air's warm." I didn't answer. I could already smell the iron. She looked up at me, her face lit faintly by the reflection of her camera's screen. "It's beautiful," she said softly, "almost like it's alive." I wanted to pull her back, to drag her away if I had to, but something in the shadows shifted before I could, a faint, rhythmic thump, subtle but unmistakable. 3 knocks. Pause. 2. Lucy froze. "What was that?" "Get back," I whispered. She tilted her head toward the darkness. "Is someone in there?" The sound came again, louder now, echoing up from within the cave. Then, from deeper still, a voice. Low, wet, familiar. It said, "Help me." Lucy raised her flashlight, pointing it into the opening. The beam quivered against the stone, caught for a moment on something pale, then slipped away. She turned to me, eyes wide. "There's someone in there." "No," I said firmly. "There isn't." But it was too late. She was already crawling forward. I grabbed her ankle, but she shook me off. The cave swallowed her light first, then her voice. "It's okay," she called. "It opens up a little. Her words cut off with a gasp. Then came a sound I'll never forget. The kind of scream that doesn't travel far, like the air itself is too thick to carry it. Then silence. I called her name over and over until my throat burned. Nothing. The cave exhaled. Warm, damp air brushed against my face, smelling of earth and something older, something like the breath of the world before it learned language. My flashlight flickered once, and in that moment of stuttering light, I saw movement at the edge of the opening. A hand, not hers. It was gray, stretched, the skin slick and patterned like the inside of bark. Long fingers flexed outward, gripping the stone as though testing the air, and then, slowly, another hand joined it. I stumbled back, heart hammering against my ribs. The hands retreated, vanishing back into the dark, but the sound remained. That breathing, heavy, slow, patient. I didn't go in. I waited for an hour, maybe more, before running back to the van. I called for help, but the radio only hissed. When the Rangers arrived the next day, they found no trace of Lucy. No prints, no gear, no cave, just an empty clearing and a patch of ground that smelled faintly of iron. They took my statement with polite disbelief. The younger ranger smirked, the way people do when they think you've cracked from guilt or drink. The older one just stared at me, expression tight. When we finished, he said quietly, "You should get out of here." He didn't mean the park. He meant the state. I did, but the forest didn't let me go clean this time either. That night, at a motel near Garberville, I woke to a photo sitting on the nightstand. One of Lucy's, the one she'd taken at the cave. Only this time there was something new in it, something standing just inside the darkness. It wasn't human, but it was wearing her jacket. And written across the bottom in the same shaky hand as before, "He breathes through us." I didn't tell anyone about the photograph. I burned it in the motel sink before dawn, but the image didn't burn clean. The photo paper bubbled and warped, the ink turning black, but the figure in the cave, Lucy's silhouette, stayed visible until the very end. I drove without direction that day, following the fog south along the coast until I didn't recognize the trees anymore. but redwood never really lets you leave. It follows in the smell of wet bark, in the way the wind hushes before dusk, in the heaviness that settles when you close your eyes. By the time I reached Fort Bragg, I hadn't spoken to another human being in 2 days. The gas station attendant asked if I was heading north or south. When I said away, he laughed, said, "Ain't no away here. Forest goes wherever you go." I didn't sleep that night. Every hour the sound returned, faint, steady, insistent. 3 knocks, pause, 2. Sometimes it came from the window, sometimes from the floor. Once, I swear I heard it from inside my chest. I kept telling myself it was guilt, the mind's way of punishing itself for the things you didn't do, the people you couldn't save. But there's a difference between guilt and haunting. Guilt lives inside you. A haunting finds its own way in. On the 3rd night, I woke to the smell again. Metallic, wet, alive. It was stronger than ever, thick enough to taste. I opened the window to clear it, but the air outside wasn't moving. The forest was absolutely still, and that's when I heard the voice. "Open the door." It was Lucy. Not exactly her voice, but close enough to tear something loose inside me. I froze, listening. The words came again, closer this time. "Please, it's cold." I wanted to believe it wasn't real, that exhaustion had finally pushed me over the edge, but my hands still moved toward the doorknob. The human instinct to respond to the sound of a familiar voice is stronger than reason. Just before I turned it, something heavy hit the other side. Once, twice. Then 5 slow drags downward, across the wood, the same streaks that had haunted every window, every pane of glass. I stepped back, shaking, whispering, "You're not her, you're not." The knocking stopped. Then came the whisper, soft and wet, right against the doorframe. "You went back without asking." I didn't breathe until dawn. When I opened the door, there was nothing. Just the morning fog curling along the asphalt and a trail of dark mud leading away from the threshold toward the tree line. I packed what little I had left and left the coast that morning. No destination, just the road. But every mile farther inland made the feeling worse, not better. The air grew heavier, not lighter. The trees looked older again, thicker, their bark slick like the walls of the cave. And the smell, God, that smell, followed. I stopped near a rest area off Route 299 when I couldn't keep driving. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely hold the wheel. There was a bench overlooking a gorge, and I sat there until the light began to fade. That's when I noticed something carved into the wooden railing. 3 sets of initials. CHCR LB Harlow, Craig, Lucy, and below them a 4th set, freshly cut into the grain. My own. I ran my fingers over the grooves, half expecting the wood to be wet. It was. Sticky, almost, like sap mixed with something else. I wiped my hand on my jeans and stared into the trees, and that's when I saw the reflection. Not in the gorge, but in the air itself, like the forest had turned into a sheet of black glass. My own face stared back at me, pale and hollow-eyed. But behind my reflection, the trees were moving, not swaying, but shifting, like something enormous was breathing beneath them. Then, faintly, from deep within the forest came the knock. 3. Pause. 2. And underneath it, another sound, like something dragging itself closer. I stumbled back toward the car, heart hammering so hard I could barely hear. The air felt charged, thick, alive. I slammed the door shut, started the engine, and drove until I couldn't see straight. I didn't stop until I hit Redding. I rented another room under a false name while checked the locks twice, turned on the TV for noise, and sat there staring at the static glow until morning. But sometime before dawn, I must have dozed off. Because when I woke, the TV was off. The radio on the nightstand was on. And through the static, a voice was whispering, "You shouldn't have left me." Craig's voice. I lunged for the plug, yanking it from the wall, but the whisper didn't stop. The voice kept speaking, slower now, every word thick and wrong. "You all breathe the same now." I threw the radio across the room. It hit the wall and shattered, but from the broken speaker, the knocking continued. 3. Pause. 2. That was the moment I understood something. It wasn't about the cave. It wasn't even about the forest. It was about what the forest uses us for. It remembers. It collects. Craig, Lucy, Harlow. Maybe every ranger who's ever gone missing in those woods didn't vanish. They were taken into the forest until the forest could breathe through them. And now it was learning to breathe through me. I left everything behind that day. My ID, my phone, my last paycheck. I drove until the gaslight came on, then walked until I couldn't feel my legs. The forest still finds me no matter how far I go. Sometimes it's just a whisper in the wind. Sometimes when I pass through a patch of fog, I can smell that metallic air again. And sometimes when I'm half asleep, I hear them. All of them. Knocking, breathing, waiting. I used to think I was running from something. Now I know I'm carrying it because every breath I take feels borrowed. Every shadow I pass seems to move in rhythm. And when I close my eyes long enough, I can feel the forest inhale. I stopped counting the days after that. Time doesn't move the same way when you're not living among people. When your only companions are shadows, the drip of rain, and the slow sound of your own heartbeat echoing off motel walls, the clock becomes meaningless. I drifted east into smaller towns that looked like they'd been half forgotten by the map. Gas stations with hand-painted signs, diners that closed before dark, motels where the lights never turned off completely. The kind of places where nobody asked your name and you were grateful for it. But Redwood never really left me. It started small, a reflection out of place, a scent of damp cedar on a dry day. Then the dreams returned. Always the same, the forest breathing around me, the cave pulsing like a heartbeat, and the voices whispering through the roots. Sometimes it was Craig, sometimes Lucy, but most often it was something else, something deeper, older, that used their voices like masks. In the dreams, it told me to come back. I'd wake up gasping, drenched in sweat, the echo of knocking still fading in my ears. 3. Pause. 2. After a while, I stopped trying to escape it. Because the thing about running from the woods is that it isn't about distance, it's about gravity. Once it's pulled you in, every road leads back to it eventually. So I did what the forest wanted. I went back. I told myself it was for closure or proof or maybe just madness finally catching up. But I needed to see it one last time to understand what it wanted from me. I rented a Jeep from a small lot in Eureka, bought a flashlight, a recorder, and a few cans of gas. The clerk asked if I was headed into the park. I said yes. She gave me a look like she'd heard that answer before. I reached the old service road by nightfall. The air was thick, wet, and cold, carrying that same smell of iron and moss I'd never been able to forget. The fog moved through the trees like smoke from an invisible fire. Every sound out there carries differently. Subtle, distant, but alive. You can hear things that might not even be sound. The crack of a branch that feels intentional. The whisper of wind that almost forms words. I parked and left the Jeep's headlights on as I walked toward the trail. My boots sank into the mud, every step heavy with that half-remembered dread. The trees rose higher than I remembered, leaning in toward the path as if to close it behind me. I kept the recorder running, its red light blinking faintly against the mist. I hesitated. I don't even know who's going to hear this. Maybe no one. But if someone finds it, don't come looking. I walked for hours before I reached the clearing. The same one. The hollow mile. Only this time, the cave wasn't a hole in the ground. It was open. Wider. Breathing visibly, the air inside shifting with the rhythm of something sleeping deep below. The earth vibrated faintly under my feet. I lifted the recorder again. I'm here. The coordinates match the old logs. I can smell the iron again. Then I froze. From inside the cave came movement. Not walking. Dragging. Something heavy scraping along the stone. I shined my light toward it, and the beam flickered across something pale moving just beyond reach. Craig, I whispered. The shape stopped. Then, in that same broken gravel voice I'd heard before, came the answer. Not Craig. I stumbled backward. The light caught the edge of something emerging. Tall, wrong, its limbs jointed at strange angles. The surface of its skin looked like bark, stretched too thin over shifting muscle. Where its eyes should have been, there were hollow grooves that pulsed faintly, glowing with that wet, reddish shimmer I'd seen in blood. It spoke again. You came back. I should have run. But there's something about hearing words come from a face that doesn't move. It freezes the will. The mouth didn't shape the sound. The voice just happened inside the air as if the forest itself was speaking through it. Why? I managed to say. To breathe, it said. Through you. Behind it, more shapes began to move in the darkness. Figures forming out of the wall, half human, half absorbed, their limbs fused to the cave's surface. I recognized the faces. Craig, Harlow, Lucy. All of them half alive, their mouths whispering the same words in unison. To breathe through you. To breathe through you. I turned and ran. Branches tore at my clothes, the mud pulling at my boots. The air behind me thickened, pressing outward like the forest itself was exhaling. I didn't dare look back. Every instinct screamed that if I did, I wouldn't make it out. I burst into the clearing, gasping, lungs burning with that metallic taste. The Jeep's headlights were still on, but the beams were twisted, bending through the fog like light underwater. For a moment, I thought I'd gone the wrong way. Then I saw the trees. Every one of them was leaning toward me, their trunks curved unnaturally like they were listening. The air hummed, a low vibration that built until it matched the pounding of my heart. And then the knocking started again. Not from the cave this time, but from everywhere. The ground. The trees. The air itself. 3, pause. 2, 3, pause. 2. It wasn't a warning anymore. It was rhythm. Breath. The sound of something vast inhaling through everything around me. I stumbled into the Jeep and slammed the door, fumbling for the keys. The radio came alive before the engine did, static, then a voice, my own, whispering to the speaker, "You went back." The headlights flickered once, twice, then died. The last thing I remember before blacking out was the forest moving closer. When I woke up, it was morning. The Jeep was gone. I was lying in the middle of an empty road, my clothes soaked in mud, my skin cold and clammy as if I'd been underwater. No one believed me when I tried to explain. They found no Jeep, no clearing, no cave, just another ranger rambling about the forest breathing. But I know what I saw, what I felt, and I know that whatever the redwood took, it keeps. Because now, sometimes, when I stand too still, I can feel something inside me shift with the rhythm of the trees, a slow, deep inhale that isn't mine. When the wind moves through the redwoods, people say it sounds like the forest is alive. They're right. It's alive. And it's breathing through us.